joining us. We have two presentations today, one from Jeffrey Clementi, one from Amanda Lindsay. Come on in. And I'm not going to take much time. The screen says it all. Just want to give Jeffrey the microphone and please go right ahead.
Okay. All good. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Jeffrey Clementi. Thank you all so much for coming to my thesis defense, and thank you to everybody listening in online. Today, I'll be talking about my thesis, studying the changes to sprinting velocity through post-activation potentiation with a Hex-Bar farmer's walk. So to first introduce the study, I want to tell you a little bit about what the study is and where it fits into the strength and conditioning research that's been done up until this point regarding acute enhancements to athletic performance. So it's very well understood now that warming up prior to really any exercise involvement is going to positively influence performance. Good. Okay. It's going to positively influence performance because previous research has shown that just by increasing the core body temperature, you're able to decrease an individual's risk of injury and increase their performance. Now, associations such as the National Strength and Conditioning Association have been able to optimize the warm-up over time by using things like a RAMP protocol, which just stands for raise, activate, mobilize, and potentiate. So now, any individual that goes through a structured warm-up is always going to start with raising their core body temperature, followed by activating and mobilizing any muscles that are going to be used in the involved exercises and the subsequent competition. Then they're going to potentiate their muscles in the warm-up. Now, potentiating exercises that the NSCA recommends are just going to be exercises that allow muscles to produce force during the warm-up, and these are going to resemble movements that are similar to the movements realized during competition. It's been shown that the capacity of force that a muscle is able to produce is dictated by that muscle's contractile history, which works to suggest that the warm-up should include contractile conditioning. These are deliberate exercises, potentiating exercises that allow a muscle to produce force during the warm-up, so it's then able to produce more force later on during competition. We refer to that now as post-activation potentiation. Post-activation potentiation is the current term, which is the increase in force that a muscle is able to produce after a conditioning contraction. We often initiate post-activation potentiation in order to cause what's known as a post-activation performance enhancement, which is just the enhancement of measures for any exercise involving max strength, power, or speed. So to sum it all up, we use a conditioning contraction to initiate post-activation potentiation and cause a post-activation performance enhancement. Now, this whole timeline of assessing the warm-up, seeing how we can use post-activation potentiation to allow a muscle to produce force, which then allows those muscles to produce even more force later on as a post-activation performance enhancement, led to the purpose of this study, which was to determine if a farmer's walk completed with a Hex-Bar at a distance of 20 meters can serve as a conditioning contraction to then initiate post-activation potentiation and cause a post-activation performance enhancement seen as an increase to 20-meter sprinting performance. At the very beginning of the study, it was hypothesized that the farmer's walk would cause an enhancement, although the magnitude of that enhancement, as well as the load required during the farmer's walk and the amount of rest an individual needs in between the farmer's walk and that subsequent 20-meter sprinting distance were unknown, but all to be tested. So the review of literature is really interesting for this topic because before there was any information on post-activation performance enhancements, the research was more geared towards complex training. Complex training is just pairing two exercises, one of a high load and one of a low load, together in the same training session to form long-term neuromuscular adaptations that increase performance over a long time. The average complex training intervention usually goes on for 6 weeks with an average of 2 times per week. So complex training research has varied quite a bit. We've seen research with untrained individuals, recreationally trained individuals, elite level athletes, mixing of complex pairs. The two exercises most commonly used have been back squats and power cleans to enhance the performance of plyometric-based exercises or exercises that utilize power, most commonly sprinting and vertical jump height. For example, Brito et al. In 2014 used 57 male college soccer players during an in-season intervention and tested a few different types of exercise modalities. He used resistance training with very high loads for one group. They used plyometric training for another group where they just performed body weight plyometrics. And then they used a complex training regimen, which was the high load resistance training, followed by the plyometric training with the body weight set for set. And at the end of their 9-week intervention, they were able to see that complex training is effective at improving 20-meter sprinting performance. And the complex training is better than resistance training and plyometric training for increasing things like the eccentric peak torque, the knee flexor muscles on the individual's non-dominant limb. But the goals of complex training are commonly to increase the rate of force development, which is the speed at which contractile tissue can produce force, because that is a component of power. Many strength and conditioning coaches would much rather have an athlete with a high rate of force development rather than a high max strength, because rate of force development is a component of power and it's a better marker for performance. If you look at this figure that I have here on the right, hopefully everybody on Zoom can see this too. This is a figure comparing 3 different individuals. Can you see it? 3 different individuals' rate of force developments. This black bar here is a plyometrically trained individual, and you'll see that they have a much higher rate of force development than that of a heavy resistance trained individual or an untrained individual. And that's because plyometric training allows your muscles to contract at near maximal or maximal capacities, but heavy resistance training commonly uses muscle contractions with a low to moderate velocity. Now, we have been able to see that the intentional velocity of a muscle contraction is much more important than the actual velocity, which means that you can increase the rate of force development with high load resistance training if the intentional velocity of that muscle contraction is completed at a maximal force. But the actual velocity, the velocity that you're witnessing, doesn't necessarily have to be that quick. Complex training has been meta-analyzed a few times. When done in 2019, it was seen as an effective method, complex training, to increase 20-meter sprinting performance, and that was over all other distances, 5 meters, 10 meters, 15, 30, 40, etc. We were also able to see in 2013 that better results can commonly be seen when the 2 exercises in the complex pair are of a similar movement pattern. I said earlier that complex training has commonly used back squats and power cleans to enhance the performance of things like sprinting, but they're of dissimilar movement patterns. We've also seen from the same study that there's no difference between sex in complex training. This type of training can be utilized for both men and women, and they can see similar results from it. Now, over time, we were able to see that post-activation potentiation is the underlying mechanism that allows these long-term complex training regimens to actually result in increased performance. And that's because post-activation potentiation is being initiated during each individual training session. So if you look at this mechanism I have here, you'll see that during the unpotentiated state, when an individual undergoes a conditioning contraction at a near maximal or maximal capacity, there's an increased sensitivity to calcium, which activates the myosin light chain kinase to then phosphorylate the myosin regulatory light chains. The classical term of post-activation potentiation refers to this phosphorylation process. In fact, the phosphorylation of myosin regulatory light chains is thought to start the rotation. Let's see if I can get my cursor over here. Start the rotation of these myosin heads away from the thick filament and towards the thin filament of actin to increase myosin cross-grid formation, which can then increase force production. Now, the very interesting thing about this mechanism is that this phosphorylation process actually occurs very quickly, but the dephosphorylation process that brings an individual back to the unpotentiated state occurs very slowly. And this just works to substantiate the use of initiating post-activation potentiation during the warm-up, because then an individual is able to undergo a very heavy conditioning contraction, potentiate their muscles, recover from that muscular fatigue, and then maintain that potentiation without the fatigue into competition. Now, once post-activation potentiation was realized to be the underlying mechanism that gave complex training regimens the ability to increase performance, more research started to emerge studying the acute enhancements that can be had from just initiating post-activation potentiation. And that was seen very well with Turner et al. In 2015, who used 23 plyometrically trained individuals to complete a plyometric intervention to then increase 20-meter sprinting performance. The very interesting thing about this study was they used 3 different conditions. They used a control group where their conditioning contraction was very light. They just walked a distance of 20 meters. Then they had a plyometric condition where they performed 3 sets of 10 alternating leg bounding, an exercise that kind of resembles skipping, as their conditioning contraction. And then they used a weighted plyometric condition. So they did the exact same intervention as the plyometric group, but now they had a weighted vest equating to 10% the individual's body weight. If you look at this figure here on the right from their research, this is the individual's 20-meter sprinting velocities. You'll see that these gray bars that represent the weighted plyometric group, they have significantly higher sprinting velocities when compared to the control group and their baseline sprints, and it was much higher during each of the the rest intervals after 4 minutes than the plyometric training condition. And the reason why this is so important is because now we can see that exercises of a similar movement pattern can be used to initiate post-activation potentiation. And more importantly, exercises that utilize a load may be more beneficial and better at initiating post-activation potentiation when compared to exercises without a load. But just because an exercise uses a load and is of a similar movement pattern does not mean that it's going to initiate post-activation potentiation or result in any enhancement. This was seen by Whelan et al. In 2014. They used 12 resistance-trained men to complete 3 sprint-style sled pulls where they're towing the load behind them. They pulled it for 10 meters with various loads, 25% and 30% their body weight. And then once that conditioning contraction was complete, they performed repeated unresisted 10-meter sprints after each of these rest intervals. So they rested for 1 minute after a conditioning contraction, ran a sprint, rested for another minute, ran a sprint, and so on. So their last sprint took place 10 minutes after their conditioning contraction. Ultimately, the researchers were able to see that there was no enhancement to sprinting performance whatsoever during any of the recovery intervals. And that was due to a few different reasons. First, the exercise was deemed too light to initiate post-activation potentiation. And that's because post-activation potentiation is thought to have a mutual relationship with fatigue being a sign that the potentiating process is actually occurring. And that was not present. Second of all, the researchers said that the exercise was too heavy for the actual movement pattern and could be detrimental if completed with heavier loads. But 2016, nothing stopped researchers from doing the exact same thing, now just using heavier loads to see if they can initiate post-activation potentiation, regardless of those detrimental movement patterns. So here in 2016, they used 22 resistance-trained men. This time we know their training history, 3.6 years of resistance training, which I'll get into why that's important later. And they completed a single sprint-style sled pull, so a little bit less volume, but this time they used 75% their body mass and 150% their body mass, so much heavier loads for distances. Yep. So they used 2 different loads, 75% their body mass and 150% their body mass for distances of 15 meters and 7.5 meters. And then they performed repeated 15-meter sprints after rest intervals of 4, 8, and 12 minutes. And here, these researchers were able to see significant improvements to sprinting velocity during the 75% condition after all of the distances tested, 5 meters, 10 meters, and 15 meters, after only 8 and 12 minutes of rest, not 4 minutes. Now, what was most important about this study was that there was no change to sprinting performance whatsoever in the heavy condition, the 150% body weight condition. It's most likely, this is what the researcher said, most likely due to the fact that the loads were detrimental to the movement pattern, but it could also mean that since those heavy loads generated a lot of fatigue, that fatigue was not able to subside after 12 minutes of rest. They may have needed more time. Let's see. Okay, so to sum it up with those 3 studies, we now know that exercises of a similar movement pattern can be beneficial at initiating post-activation potentiation when you're using a load that is at a near maximal or maximal capacity and not a submaximal capacity that doesn't produce any fatigue. And you always need to remember to include an ample amount of time to let the individuals recover from the fatiguing effects of that conditioning contraction. Meta-analyses have shown that the optimal amount of time to allow for a post-activation performance enhancement to occur is giving 7 to 10 minutes of rest in between the conditioning contraction and the lighter resistance exercise. And that brings us to strongman training. Strongman training is a unique type of training that utilizes high loads at maximal velocities. They commonly use sprint-style sled pulls as one of their flagship exercises, where farmers walks are probably a close second. And farmers walks utilize these farmers bars. The farmers walk just requires an athlete to lift up a load and carry it for a specific distance. And these bars are plate loaded bars, kind of resemble dumbbells, and they have very high handles. This exercise is commonly utilized with loads exceeding 70% in individuals deadlift 1 rep max, and they're pretty much utilized between distances of 20 and 50 meters. Now, when comparing the lifting portion of the farmer's bar to a conventional deadlift, we've been able to see that there's more anterior propulsive and vertical forces that are generated because of less apparent stress to the lumbar spine and a more vertical trunk position. But the walking portion of the farmer's walk, when compared to an unloaded walk, where we're able to see significantly higher ground forces when utilizing 70% in individuals deadlift 1 rep max, although very heavy loads have been utilized, such as in 2014, where individuals carried nearly 400 pounds for distances up to 20 meters. Now, the Hex-Bar is a very interesting piece of equipment that can also be used for farmers walks, because there's research studying the Hex-Bar deadlift when compared to a conventional deadlift. The Hex-Bar can produce much higher ground forces when utilizing loads between 20 and 80% in individuals 1 rep max. And the Hex-Bar features a wide area that will not disrupt the gait pattern. And it also features the same high handles that are used for the farmer's bars. The farmer's walk can make for a great exercise to pair with sprinting because they have a lot of similarities. So when comparing sprinting to the farmer's walk, there's quite a bit of similarities. They're both completed with the intent of being completed as quickly as possible. They're both improved with increased ground forces, step length, and step frequency. And they're both improved by reducing ground contact time, which is why I originally thought that they would make for a good complex pair. So how did I use these 2 exercises in my research? So through a 4-day randomized and counterbalanced design, 12 participants completed each of these 3 conditions, separated by no less than 48 hours. And then after these 3 conditions, they performed repeated 20-meter sprints. Everyone see it? Repeated 20-meter sprints after 4, 8, 12, and 16 minutes of rest. So we used a control condition, which was a very light body weight exercise of just walking a distance of 20 meters as quickly as possible. So no load, no Hex-Bar, no weights. And then we had a light farmer's walk and heavy farmer's walk condition where individuals carried 70% and 80% their Hex-Bar deadlift 1 rep max, also as quickly as possible for a distance of 20 meters. Once those conditioning contractions were complete, they first rested for 4 minutes, ran their first experimental sprint, and then so on. So their last sprint took place 16 minutes after the conditioning contraction. So to start the day 1 procedures, 12 participants came to this lab, the Human Performance Lab, separately, and they signed all the appropriate, they signed all the appropriate paperwork, informed consent, PAR-Q, health history survey. Then we collected very basic anthropometrics, did a brief warm-up, and then finally, to finish the day 1 procedures, we recorded a Hex-Bar deadlift 1 rep max. Now, I mentioned earlier that it's very important that previous research disclose the amount of training history that participants have. Previously, they've only tracked resistance training history. In the last study I mentioned with the sprint style sled poles, they had 3.6 years of resistance training experience. That's important because most post-activation potentiation research is better done, or post-activation potentiation is better initiated in individuals with a very high training history, and that's because post-activation potentiation is found to be initiated in type 2 muscle fibers, which are generally more abundant in individuals with a higher training history. So for this study, the previous study had 3.6 years of resistance training experience. In this study, we had 4.75 years of resistance training experience, much higher. And we also had 5.58 years of running experience, which is very good because we are trying to enhance running performance. Like I said, we used 12 individuals, 9 men and 3 women. And the other inclusion criteria was that they just had to be between the ages of 18 and 29 years old and injury-free for the past 6 months. Now, the days 2, 3, and 4 procedures started the exact same way. We went through the exact same warm-up as day 1, starting with raising the core body temperature through a 5-minute walk on the treadmill at an incline of 2 and speed at 3 miles an hour. Then once 2.5 minutes elapsed, we start to increase the speed by 0.1 miles per hour every 15 seconds until 5 minutes was achieved. So the final speed was 4 miles an hour, which is about 7 minutes. Once the treadmill warm-up was complete, we ran through a variety of activating and mobilizing techniques, starting with dynamic leg swings, hamstring sweeps, then moving on to bird dogs, sit-ups, and then a walking active recovery to the gym, where they concluded with a light potentiating exercise, just a gradual 20-meter sprint that increased in intensity over the course of the distance. So after that warm-up was complete, this is the same. Okay. So after the warm-up was complete, we did a baseline 20-meter sprint at the start of each of these days. And then they were randomized into one of 3 conditions, which I spoke about earlier, the control, light farmer's walk, and heavy farmer's walk conditions. Once their conditioning contraction was complete, they immediately rested for 4 minutes, ran their first experimental sprint, same speed, same distance as the baseline, rested again for 4 minutes, ran another sprint, rested again, and so on. So their last sprint again took place 16 minutes after their conditioning contraction. Once that was all complete, the participants were dismissed and returned no less than 48 hours later to do their next randomized condition following the exact same procedure. Now, in order to record the baseline sprint, the farmer's walk, and each of the experimental sprints, we use these dasher performance system timing gate. We use them because they were very consistent and accurate down to a 100th of a second. And they also allow for the use of a dash rather than a flying start. If we used a flying start, we would have been accounting for reaction time, which is not a part of the study. So instead, all the participants lined up at exactly 20 meters in between the line of the timing gate. So you can see the beam on my hip. How it worked is I would press go on the timer and they would hear a beep. Once they heard the beep, they were instructed to just go whenever they're ready. So I told them, take a breath and just go whenever you're ready. The instant that they accelerated forward, this beam connects with this reflector here on the right, which starts the timer. Then they run at maximal speed and they cross another timing gate to record a 10-meter split. So that was at 10 meters. And then they continue to accelerate through there. And the instant they cross the finish line, where the last timing gate was at 20 meters, the timer stopped. We also were able to record the farmer's walk time in between the beam of the laser. So how it worked was the participants picked up the load, and the instant, this was just recorded in my home gym, the instant they started to walk with the load, the beam reconnects and the timer starts. And then the instant they put the load down after they crossed the finish line, we started another timer to record the 4-minute rest interval. Okay, so once all the 12 participants completed the Hex-Bar deadlift 1 rep max on day 1, they completed each of the 3 conditions. We were able to use paired sample t-test analysis, and with a significance level set to a p-value of less than 0.05. And we were able to look at each of those experimental sprints compared to the baseline sprints. And we were also able to look at each experimental sprint at one specific time interval compared to another condition at a specific time interval. For example, the control group at 8 minutes compared to the light farmer's walk condition at 8 minutes. So at baseline, there was no statistical significant difference at 10 meters or 20 meters at baseline. And more importantly, there was no change to sprinting performance at either distance during the control condition, which was to be expected because there was no potentiating or fatiguing exercise that was done during that conditioning contraction. They just walked with their body weight for 20 meters. So they didn't do anything that would significantly affect each of these subsequent sprints. But thereafter, at 20 meters, the light farmer's walk condition, we were able to see significant improvements to sprinting velocity after 8, 12, and 16 minutes of rest. And that is compared to the baseline sprint. So this is the light farmer's walk. We're looking at this green bar here, and we're comparing 8, 12, and 16 to their baseline sprint. That's the sprint they completed that day before their conditioning contraction. Similarly, at 20 meters, during the heavy farmer's walk condition, we were able to see significant improvements to sprinting velocity at all of the recovery intervals, 4, 8, 12, and 16 minutes, with their best sprints performed at 4 minutes and 8 minutes, which was a surprise to me. I believed at the start of this study that they were going to require much more time to recover from that very heavy conditioning contraction and have their performance enhancements much later on. But the fact was that they were, in fact, able to recover from that fatigue within 4 minutes and maintain the potentiation to 8 minutes, and then it slowly decreased at 12 and 16, but they were still significant compared to their baseline. At 10 meters, we saw significant improvements to sprinting velocity at 8 minutes and 12 minutes with no changes whatsoever during the heavy farmer's walk condition. So only significant changes with the 70% farmer's walk. But more importantly, measuring between conditions at a distance of 20 meters, the light farmer's walk again showed significant improvements to sprinting velocity at 8, 12, and 16 minutes of rest compared to the control interval now at 8, 12, and 16 minutes. So we're comparing this green bar with the light farmer's walk compared to the control, which is the blue bar here. So at 8, 12, and 16 minutes, they were significantly faster than the same time interval at the control condition. And the reason why this is so important is because the only thing that changed in between these two conditions was the load they were carrying during the farmer's walk, which works to isolate that the farmer's walk with that specific load was able to generate increased 20-meter sprinting performance. Also, we saw the same thing at 10 meters, but only at 8 minutes during the light farmer's walk condition. Nothing during the control, as I said earlier, and again, nothing with the heavy farmer's walk condition. The reason why this is so important at 8 minutes is because the previous meta-analysis that I showed said that the most optimal time to see an enhancement is anywhere between 7 and 10 minutes. And this is right in the middle at 8 minutes. All of the sprinting, the significant increases to sprinting velocity have been witnessed at 8 minutes for each of the controls that were able to yield an enhancement. So to conclude on all of these findings, we are able to now say that the farmer's walk can acutely enhance sprinting performance at different distances of 10 meters and 20 meters while using various loads of 70% and 80% in individuals, Hex-Bar deadlift 1 rep max, and after various rest intervals. But it is very important to remember post-activation potentiation is largely individualized. In fact, participants had their greatest enhancements all at different time periods, at different recovery intervals, and with different loads. There were some individuals that only had enhancements with the 80% condition because they needed the heavier load. There are some individuals that needed 4 minutes to show their best enhancement. There were others that needed 16 minutes, but the training experience is really what let this study shine. The participants in this study had 5.58 years of running experience and 4.75 years of resistance training experience. And that is really what allowed this study to show the enhancements and generate that post-activation potentiation. Now, we always have to remember that there is a delicate balance between fatigue and potentiation. We are looking at repeat measures within minutes. So if this were to ever be used in a competition setting during the warm-up, we always have to determine it in individuals 1 rep max way beforehand. We have to test each of these loads and their specific recovery intervals that they need to show their greatest enhancements, and it needs to be down to a minute. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm so glad I got to do this. I had so much help and I really appreciate everybody's involvement in it. If you have any questions, I'm ready.
Let's make these come up. On the
Okay.
screen.
Yeah. Very nice. Okay. Oh my God. All right.
Sorry for the glitch with the,
No problem at all.
Can you go back to one of the first screen? I know you said everybody showed something around, there was one screen that showed people had enhancement at the 4-minute mark.
Oh, for which distance? One of mine? Or one of the other studies?
Come back one. That one. No.
This is 20 meters with the heavy farmer's walk.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, yes. So for some people that potentially could work then.
So the most common distance and the most common rest interval was going to be either the light farmer's walk condition at 8 minutes, but people's greatest enhancements with the heavier loads were seen at 4 minutes and 8 minutes. They had a sprinting velocity just over 6 for both of these time intervals. I do believe that it was because the heavy conditioning contraction allowed more of a potentiating effect, and it was able to subside after only 4 minutes. Previous research has used rest intervals before 4 minutes as well. We've seen rest intervals no rest interval at all, so immediately after they were going to sprint. That was usually detrimental to performance. We've seen 15 seconds after a conditioned contraction and 2 minutes. All those previous studies that use similar movement patterns as well either showed no enhancement to performance or it was detrimental to performance, which is why I omitted it, and I'm glad I did. But yes, 4 minutes and 8 minutes, they showed their best enhancements with 80% of their 1 rep max. Anyone else? Yes.
Why do you think that happened? Before 8 minutes, what do you think training status, anything like that? What do you think happened?
Why they were able to maintain the potentiation?
I mean, you have your best potentiation 4 to 8 minutes and it kind of tails off.
Oh, so a few different reasons. One, I do believe, well, the potentiating process only lasts a few minutes, so it is going to dissipate over time. And two, there could be a factor of the repeated sprints causing an additional fatiguing effect that could allow the potentiating process to dissipate. But I don't believe that was seen during, let's see, is this the light farmer's walk? But during the light farmer's walk, it improved from 8 to 12. So it could just be dependent on the load and how an individual is able to recover from that load. Some individuals can recover faster than others. That's why it's completely individualized.
So the higher the training status, the more ability to go ahead and clear everything out, get right back in.
Sometimes, not for everybody, but yeah. Some individuals had very, very heavy deadlift 1 rep maxes, and some individuals were weaker. I originally thought there was going to be a difference in when those people were going to show their best enhancement, but there really is no correlation. Some individuals that had very low 1 rep maxes and one individual that had a very, very high 1 rep max, each had their greatest enhancement with the same condition and at the same recovery interval. So it's not technically dependent on your strength status either. I mean, maybe it's going to, usually we do see better enhancements with people that have higher training history. Specifically, if future research were to be done, they would have to use at least 5.58 years of running experience to show something like this. Anything else?
Yes, Dr. Flores.
Yes, hi. I think I missed this part of the presentation. What was the difference between a light farmer's walk versus the heavy farmer's walk?
Okay, so let me go to that slide.
Sorry that I missed it.
That's fine. So at a distance of 20 meters, the light farmer's walk was able to show significantly improved sprinting velocities after 8, 12, and 16 minutes of rest. And then the heavy farmer's walk at the same distance, 20 meters, showed significant improvements in sprinting velocity at all the recovery intervals, this time at 4 minutes included, which was not done during, the light farmer's walk condition.
He might be asking the load that was.
Oh,
Yeah,
so the loads that were utilized, the loads that were utilized were 70%, 70%, and 80% in individuals Hex-Bar deadlift 1 rep max.
Oh, okay.
For each of the conditions. So yeah, light farmer's walk and then heavy farmer's walk.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Okay.
Anyone else?
Anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
So what's the practical implications of this? Where can it be used in terms of the strength and conditioning setting and or in the sport?
Great question.
Competition setting?
Great question. The
Of
NS,
course it is.
yeah, right. So the NSCA.
I just said it didn't matter.
Oh, yeah.
It's supposed to come.
Sorry. So the NSCA already recommends that potentiating exercises are included in that ramp protocol. The research, as I said earlier, has kind of been scattered all over the place with mixing of complex pairs. Pertaining to this specific research, we can use this ahead of time. We can use a okay, thank you. We can use conditioning contractions ahead of time to allow a muscle to produce more force later on, but this can be used in the future for a complex training intervention research, because previous research used to jump right to complex training without understanding if post-activation potentiation was actually being initiated during each session. So you can see if you participate in a 6-week study and you don't even know if complex post-activation potentiation is being initiated, it's not going to form any neuromuscular adaptations. So in the future, now we know that with these loads, with these distances, and with these recovery intervals, we do initiate post-activation potentiation. And I mean, there would be more work to be done to determine how much time would be given in between the conditioning contraction and the lighter resistance exercise to form those long-term adaptations. But future research in complex training and using this in the warm-up to potentiate 20-meter sprint. So, yes.
So, quick question, I don't know if you did this, but did you figure out with their 1 rep maxes, like 70 or 80%, what percent of their body weight they were lifting, like 1.5 times, 2 times, 1 point?
I didn't do it. I was thinking about it, but I don't think it's going to correlate anything.
Just curious.
Yeah, a lot of the other studies, like the ones I included about the sprint style slug pulls, they're towing a load behind them, so they actually used a percentage of the body weight to determine the load. We had to derive the load from a technically different exercise, the Hex-Bar deadlift 1 rep max. And the reason why we chose 80% was it's about the most an individual can carry for that distance. Yeah.
Dr. Fitter,
Yeah.
just to answer that too, that 1.5 to 2 point or 2 above what your body would be for a plyometric, we're jumping up and down in vertical, that would be applicable, horizontal, not.
Got it.
Okay. Yes.
Did you control for supplement use?
We control for caffeine. That was the only thing. So we just said to avoid caffeine, and if they did have it, to continue the use for each day. And that was it. But they were.
Do you know if they were taking anything else, pre-workouts?
No pre-workouts, just coffee. Yeah. I wish I could track their sleep and nutrition and all that too. But...
Another question.
Okay.
Yes, Dr. Flores.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
My question, can you hear me?
Yes.
My question would be then, based on your findings, then somebody that is training, sprinter is training right now, what would be your suggestion? Somebody that is adding this to the training, what would be your suggestion for somebody that is including this type of exercise in their routine? Okay,
so we can extrapolate and say that they can use the farmer's walk in a complex training regimen, because I do believe, since the farmer's walk shares a lot of similarities with sprinting, that it is going to form those long-term adaptations that are going to increase sprinting performance over a long period of time. I don't know exactly how that would look, but I do believe that utilizing loads of 70% and 80% in individual 1 rep max over a gradual amount of time will aid in increasing sprinting performance. Hopefully in the future, there can be more research done using this type of an exercise in a complex training intervention. But other than that, including complex training is going to be generally more beneficial for a sprinter, because they're getting that heavy resistance exercise followed by those explosive muscle contractions. A lot of the research I actually ended up including in my written thesis was pertaining to soccer players. Because on average, a soccer player runs 120-meter sprint every 90 seconds. And we've been able to see from that research that complex training interventions in season and out of season can aid in the increase in overall short distance sprinting performance. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent.
All right. Anybody else?
Anyone else? Did you learn something from this?
Okay. Yeah, I definitely learned a lot. It was really tough because I didn't have a lot of research to go off of when determining anything with the farmer's walk. A lot of the research was going to be geared towards like the biomechanics that I included of like either a Hex-Bar or, I mean, there were a few articles covering the farmer's walk because it is a component of strongman training. But I just learned a lot about really how force can be generated during a warm-up and then carrying that force throughout competition, and then really just optimizing that and allowing it to increase performance over a short distance of time. I had no idea that it could really do that aside from complex training, and especially done in this fashion. It was very, very interesting to learn about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming in. Okay.
Right, so, all right, we have one more presentation. I'm just gonna